On the 1st of April, 2024,
the Euphrates River is no ordinary river. It is one of the oldest names written into human history, and one of the few rivers mentioned directly in prophecy. Now, shocking footage shows floodwaters exploding over its banks, sections of the river collapsing into sudden sinkholes, trees dragged into violent whirlpools, and strange movements rippling beneath the surface. What is happening to this ancient waterway? Coincidence or convergence? The world is watching as the Euphrates shifts in ways that feel unsettlingly symbolic. Some believe these are just natural events. Others see something far bigger unfolding. If this message speaks to you, like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more updates. For centuries, the Euphrates has flowed as a witness to empires, faith, and human ambition, carving its path through lands where some of the earliest biblical events unfolded. It has marked borders, sustained civilizations, and stood as a silent backdrop to promises and prophecies recorded thousands of years ago. Yet a river that carries so much history also carries consequence, because when ancient waters shift, they do not move quietly. They reshape everything in their reach. The Euphrates did not whisper. It roared. Days of relentless rainfall pressed against the ancient river until restraint gave way. What began as a steady rise turned into a violent surge, as if the water itself had reached a breaking point. The surface swelled, darkened, and then advanced, without mercy. Within moments, towering waves rolled forward with frightening force, slamming into embankments and tearing through everything that stood too close. People who had walked those shores their entire lives found themselves thrown off balance, swallowed by currents that showed no hesitation. The river did not overflow gently. It lunged. Entire neighborhoods along the banks were caught in a rush of brown fury. Streets dissolved beneath churning torrents, vehicles spun like toys, and doorways that once marked safety became entry points for destruction. The current carved new paths through concrete and soil alike, erasing the illusion of permanence. Homes trembled under the pressure, foundations strained, and walls that had endured decades cracked under a single night of unrestrained force. Infrastructure folded under the assault, bridges split along their seams as water hammered against their pillars, while asphalt peeled back in jagged strips as though the ground itself had grown tired of holding firm. Power lines sagged and then failed, plunging entire districts into darkness. Clean water systems faltered, leaving communities cut off not only by flood, but by silence. In the space of hours, what had been functional became fragile, and what had seemed secure revealed its vulnerability. Witnesses struggled to describe what they were seeing. Longtime residents insisted they had never observed the Euphrates move with such aggression, never watched it twist with that level of intensity. Elders who carried memories of past floods shook their heads, unable to compare this event to anything in living memory. The scale felt different. The temperament felt altered. It was not merely high water. It was upheaval. And that is where the unease deepened. Because this is no anonymous stream, the Euphrates is woven into the earliest chapters of human civilization and etched into the pages of Scripture. It is a river whose name echoes through sacred text, a boundary line in ancient prophecy, a geographical marker that carries spiritual weight. When such a river convulses, observers do not respond as they would to an ordinary storm. They look twice. They listen harder. Some call it extreme weather. Others call it instability. Yet, beneath the analysis and the satellite imagery lies a quieter tension, the sense that something larger is shifting. When land and water move with synchronized violence, when structures crumble and darkness falls across whole communities, attention drifts beyond meteorology. It drifts toward meaning. The Euphrates has flowed for millennia, witnessing empires rise and collapse along its banks. Now the world watches it in return, asking whether this surge is only a chapter in climate patterns or a tremor within a far greater narrative. The river surged. The ground fractured. The question remains, suspended like the storm clouds above it. What does it mean when an ancient boundary begins to break? The river did not just collapse. It exposed something. Beneath the force of swollen waters, a section of the Euphrates bed suddenly gave way, as though the ancient foundation had been hollowed from within. The surface buckled and folded into itself, forming a dark cavity that swallowed the current in a violent inward spiral. What had looked stable seconds earlier revealed hidden weakness beneath the flow, and the water responded with a twisting descent that felt almost intentional. The movement was not gentle, it was abrupt and consuming. Trees along the bank tilted in slow disbelief before sliding toward the center of the subsidence. Roots tore free from loosened soil, trunks scraped against one another, and entire clusters of vegetation vanished into the churning void. Earth followed wood. Heavy slabs of sediment fractured and tumbled downward, feeding a muddy vortex that thickened with debris and stone. The geometry of the river changed before the eye could adjust. Instead of traveling forward in a steady path, the current bent around the collapse zone in unnatural arcs, accelerating and retreating at once. What had been a continuous flow became distorted, unstable, unpredictable. Within minutes, a stretch of river transformed into a scarred depression, reshaping the landscape without warning. And this is where the unease deepens. Because the Euphrates is not an anonymous waterway, it is named directly in Book of Revelation 16:12, where Scripture speaks of the river being prepared for events tied to the final unfolding of history. Throughout the Bible, shifts in land and water are rarely described as random background events. They accompany moments of divine intervention, warnings, and turning points. When ground collapses beneath an ancient river whose name echoes through prophecy, some see more than geology. They remember how Scripture describes foundations being shaken before greater revelations unfold. They recall how signs often appear in physical form before spiritual realities become clear. The Euphrates continued to flow after the subsidence, but it did not look the same. A wound remained where the riverbed surrendered, a visible reminder that what seems solid can conceal fragility beneath. For those who read the prophetic texts, the image is difficult to ignore. If a river tied to biblical narrative begins to fracture, is it merely erosion, or is it an echo of something long foretold? If this moment feels like more than geology to you, comment one word: awaken. Under the weight of its own force, the river tore its borders apart. Along the Euphrates, the bank did not slowly crumble into the water. It split with a violent snap that echoed across the shoreline. A jagged fracture ripped through compacted earth, slicing across layers of soil that had stood undisturbed for generations. The ground shuddered, widened, and then surrendered in a sudden downward plunge that sent entire sections collapsing into the current. This was not erosion, it was disintegration. Massive slabs of land sheared away from the edge and dropped into the river with crushing force. Dust burst upward as roots snapped and stones shattered. The collapse carved a deep, raw gash where stable ground had existed moments earlier. What had been a clear boundary between land and water dissolved into a broken descent of unstable layers. The Euphrates surged into the breach with ruthless intensity. Water rushed through the rupture, thick with sediment, clay, and debris, striking exposed earth with amplified pressure. Each surge undercut what remained of the bank, loosening more sections and pulling them into the flow. The destruction did not stop with a single fall. It moved in sequence. One collapse triggered another, then another. The shoreline began to unravel in stages, like a seam tearing open along its entire length. The sound was relentless. Cracking earth, grinding stone, and roaring current merged into a continuous rumble that made retreat feel urgent. Areas that had been considered secure only minutes earlier began to tilt under redistributed strain. The process advanced laterally, spreading instability beyond the initial break. What once appeared firm and permanent became fractured and uncertain. The transformation happened with terrifying speed. Contours shifted in real time, Pathways disappeared. Edges dissolved into sloping mounds of loosened sediment. The river widened where resistance failed, reshaping its course with aggressive determination. Observers did not witness a gradual change in terrain. They watched a boundary collapse before their eyes. For those who know Scripture, the imagery resonates beyond geology. The Euphrates is named in Book of Revelation 16:12, associated with events that mark a turning point in prophetic sequence. Throughout the Bible, when foundations fracture and ground gives way, the language often signals transition, exposure, or warning. Stability breaking apart becomes more than physical detail. Here, the ancient river did not simply rise. It dismantled its own border. Boundaries failed in succession. Earth surrendered in layers. The current advanced without hesitation. And when a river tied to biblical narrative begins to tear through its own banks, the question shifts from what collapsed to what might be unfolding next. As floodwaters distorted the surface of the Euphrates, witnesses began noticing movements that did not match drifting debris or ordinary turbulence, and what they recorded quickly unsettled anyone who watched the footage closely. From beneath the murky current, a massive curved shape rose briefly above the surface, arching with a thickness and structure that resembled a serpent's tail before slipping back into the depths with unsettling precision. The disturbance did not end with that single emergence, because the river itself seemed to react in localized zones where the surface tightened into spirals and clusters of bubbles surged upward in concentrated bursts. Instead of random splashing, the water formed circular patterns that expanded and collapsed in repeated intervals, as though something below displaced enormous volumes of liquid before retreating again. The current bent around those areas, shifting direction momentarily before resuming its forward motion, which gave the impression of force interacting with force beneath the visible layer. No official explanation followed, and no confirmed biological identification or mechanical cause was released to calm speculation, which only intensified as the footage spread across platforms worldwide. Analysts slowed the frames, enhanced contrast, and debated shadow angles, yet none could fully dismiss the structured motion or the density of the form that surfaced. The lack of clarity fed deeper curiosity, especially because of where the event occurred. In earlier biblical imagery, powerful creatures of the deep, such as Leviathan, are described as symbols of strength beyond human control, embodying chaos restrained only by divine authority. While no direct claim links that ancient symbolism to this modern phenomenon, the resonance is difficult to ignore when unusual movement surfaces in a river embedded within Scripture. As images circulated globally, interpretation multiplied, and what began as a brief visual anomaly transformed into a broader conversation about hidden forces beneath ancient waters. Some argued for displaced wildlife reacting to flood conditions, while others suggested submerged structures destabilized by shifting terrain. Yet the pattern and timing left many unconvinced that coincidence alone explained the sequence. The river eventually smoothed, at least on the surface, but the questions remained suspended in collective awareness, because when something rises briefly from a prophetic river and then vanishes without explanation, attention shifts from what was seen to what might still remain concealed below. The river did not only claim land, it trapped lives within its reach. As the Euphrates surged beyond its boundaries, entire riverside communities found themselves surrounded by rising water that cut off every familiar path to safety. Streets that once connected neighborhoods disappeared beneath thick currents, and rooftops became temporary refuges for families who could no longer descend to ground level without stepping into danger. Parents lifted children above shoulder height while scanning the horizon for rescue teams that seemed impossibly distant. Isolation settled in with suffocating weight. Communication lines faltered as power failed, leaving many residents without reliable updates or reassurance. Boats struggled against unpredictable flow patterns, and access routes that emergency crews had used before were now submerged or fractured. In several districts, rescue operations began, yet the scale of disruption meant that help moved slower than fear. Sirens echoed, helicopters circled, and still some pockets of the population remained unreachable. Beyond the immediate threat to human life, the river's expansion swallowed livelihoods with ruthless efficiency. Fields that had supported families for generations vanished beneath opaque floodwater. Crops ready for harvest dissolved into brown expanses that offered no sign of recovery. Irrigation channels blurred into the main current, erasing boundaries between cultivated land and uncontrolled surge. Farmers who once measured seasons by predictable cycles stood helpless as months of labor disappeared within hours. The danger did not stabilize when the initial surge slowed. Saturated ground weakened further under the pressure of lingering moisture, increasing the likelihood of additional landslides along unstable banks. Contaminants from overwhelmed sewage systems and displaced debris mixed into the water supply, raising concerns about disease and long-term environmental damage. What had begun as a flood evolved into a layered crisis, combining structural instability with public health risk. Psychological strain intensified as uncertainty expanded. Residents who had survived the first wave of destruction began to confront questions that stretched beyond immediate survival. Where would they return if homes were structurally compromised? How long would fields remain unusable? Would the river retreat quietly? Or would another surge follow? Conversations shifted from present danger to future vulnerability, revealing anxiety that extended deeper than physical displacement. The Euphrates has always been a source of sustenance and settlement, yet in moments like this, it becomes a reminder of how quickly stability can dissolve. Communities that once thrived along its banks now faced a reality defined by unpredictability and interruption. The crisis was no longer confined to rising water levels or damaged infrastructure. It evolved into a confrontation with fragility itself. Rescue efforts continued, and some areas gradually regained contact with the outside world, yet the psychological and economic impact lingered. The river moved forward, but those living beside it understood that survival was only the first chapter. What followed would determine whether resilience could outlast disruption, or whether the scars left behind would redefine the relationship between people and the ancient water that both sustains and threatens them. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video so more people can see what's unfolding along the Euphrates. This is no longer about water levels or collapsing soil. It is about timing. The name Euphrates appears explicitly in Book of Revelation 16:12, positioned within a prophetic sequence that unfolds step by step rather than all at once. In that passage, the river functions as a preparatory line, a boundary connected to events that escalate toward global confrontation. The text does not present it as scenery, it presents it as part of a transition. Biblical prophecy often describes history moving in stages, where visible shifts signal invisible progression. The language is not limited to metaphor. It portrays moments when what seems stable begins aligning with something larger than immediate explanation. Patterns matter. Order matters. Sequence matters. When developments cluster around a location already embedded in prophetic narrative, observers begin asking whether convergence is accidental or structured. The unease does not stem from a single incident. It grows from accumulation, from multiple disruptions gathering around a river whose name has carried weight for centuries. Scripture speaks of seasons that must unfold before culmination, urging watchfulness rather than speculation. It cautions against fixing dates, yet it encourages discernment when patterns intensify. For many believers, this leads directly to the promise of Jesus' return, described throughout the New Testament. The emphasis there is not on panic, but on preparedness. End quote. Christ speaks of awareness, of recognizing shifts without being consumed by fear. The apostolic writings reinforce that certain developments would precede fulfillment, not to create hysteria, but to awaken attention. The world is watching because the symbolism is difficult to ignore. A river tied to prophetic sequence appears in headlines connected to instability, and even those unfamiliar with biblical text sense that the resonance feels heavier than coincidence. The question is no longer confined to environmental analysis. It presses into interpretation. Are these events isolated, disconnected, and purely natural? Or do they fit within a framework written long before modern cameras captured the images? Scripture does not command immediate conclusions. It calls for sober reflection. And so the tension remains suspended in the present moment, as history advances and observers weigh whether what is unfolding represents ordinary turbulence or the early alignment of something long foretold. What once felt stable is beginning to fracture beneath the surface of everyday life, and the shift is no longer subtle enough to ignore. Experts may categorize unfolding events as environmental cycles or statistical probability, yet the frequency and intensity of disruption across different regions create a rhythm that feels coordinated rather than isolated. The danger does not lie only in collapsing structures or rising instability, because humanity has endured crises before and rebuilt afterward. The deeper threat emerges when repeated upheaval becomes background noise, when shock turns into scrolling, and when extraordinary developments lose their ability to awaken reflection. Indifference grows quietly, and spiritual alertness weakens without resistance. Biblical history records moments when generations failed to recognize the weight of their own season, continuing daily routines while decisive transitions unfolded around them. Jesus described a time when normal activity would continue uninterrupted until sudden revelation interrupted expectation, emphasizing preparedness rather than panic. The warning was never framed as hysteria, but as awareness, never as fear, but as readiness. When patterns intensify and disturbances accumulate, the essential question shifts from explanation to response. It becomes less about identifying every cause and more about discerning the direction of history itself. Scripture consistently urges watchfulness, suggesting that recognition belongs to those who remain spiritually attentive rather than those distracted by repetition. This conversation is no longer confined to geography or analysis, because it reaches inward toward personal posture. If acceleration defines the moment, then neutrality becomes difficult to maintain. If promise and warning coexist within the same prophetic framework, then complacency carries risk. The issue is not whether every event fulfills prophecy in precise sequence, because Scripture itself cautions against fixing dates or forcing interpretation. The issue is whether hearts remain awake in a time that feels increasingly unstable. When what was once called normal begins to erode, the call to discernment grows louder. The final tension rests not in headlines but in response, not in speculation but in preparation. If Christ's return stands as a promise woven throughout the New Testament, then readiness becomes a matter of conviction rather than curiosity. And if the season is shifting in ways that unsettle assumption, the most urgent question is not what the world will do next, but whether you are prepared for what may follow. If this message challenged you or made you think, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more updates. Thank you for watching and for being part of this conversation.